Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Baker Institute. John Diamond has told me that the discussion was rather vigorous, and we like that, and the debate. We're very pleased to have had with us Senator Alan Simpson and Secretary Baker join us at the reception. As you know, Senator Simpson is our keynote speaker tomorrow morning. Both the Senator and the Secretary are good and close friends, and we're very happy that they were able to join us for the reception. To state the obvious, we're gathered here at a time of increasing uncertainty over the path of our nation's economy and the global economy. Somber economic statistics and economic headwinds from sovereign debt problems in the EU have led to a slow economic growth and increasing asset price volatility in the stock market, we're all painfully aware of. At the same time, contentious debates are taking place in Washington over whether more fiscal and monetary stimulus is needed, and debates over the ultimate effect of such policies on economic activity are continuing, as was reflected from what I understand in the sessions this afternoon here. The events of the last year have underscored the importance of reducing our national debt and deficit, decreasing the rate of unemployment, and reforming entitlement programs responsibly. It's a tall order. In either the short run or the long run, more substantial tax reform, along with spending cuts, will probably be necessary to address budget imbalances. It's going to have to be some sort of blend. Here at the Baker Institute, we produced a major report. I think many of you have seen the report. It's available, Fundamental Tax Reform Then and Now, which concluded that the conditions are right for another sweeping reform of the tax system, and indeed, the case for reform may be even stronger today than it was prior to the passage of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which then Secretary of the Treasury James A. Baker III had a big role. But it won't be easy. No one knows this better than Secretary Baker, as he wrote in his memoir, Work Hard, Study, and Keep Out of Politics. He obviously didn't follow that dictum. That's what his family told him. His father told him, work hard, study, and keep out of politics. He was a very undisciplined child. He went into politics. From the day Don Regan laid out his first tax reform proposal until President Reagan signed the Bipartisan Tax Reform Act of 1986 took almost 2 years, he wrote in his book. So the lesson is that this is hard work. It takes time. But it can be done. Tax reform can be done if the political will exists. And I will confide to you that this excellent report that John Diamond and George Zudrow did here at the Baker Institute, Secretary Baker brought this report at a private meeting he had with President Obama and outlined the report to him and made the pitch that, Mr. President, this is something that can be done. There can be a bipartisan consensus brought about on tax reform. It is not impossible. It's within the realm of the political possible. But unfortunately, it isn't being done. We're also honored that former Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming will deliver the keynote address to open tomorrow's proceedings. An eminent public servant, as you all know, for 3 decades, he has eloquently and forcefully called for fiscal reform. The National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform that he co-chaired with Erskine Bowles produced one of the most timely and authoritative plans for dealing with the fiscal challenges facing the country. Senator Simpson will be giving you his views on the Commission's work and the prognosis of what he sees is within the realm of what may be done and may not be done. So now please allow me to say a few words about tomorrow's events. You have your programs. After Senator Simpson delivers his address, a number of important topics will be discussed in depth. These topics will include an assessment of expenditure reform strategies, including in the United States, Greece, and other European countries, a Social Security reform in the United States, the challenges facing the United States in financing its budget deficits, and tax reform. It promises to be a very interesting day. Before I conclude, I would like to recognize the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and Ernst & Young LLP for helping to underwrite this conference, and we're truly grateful for their support. I just want to make one pitch as a former diplomat that I've read Neil Ferguson, and I tend to agree with his historic economic analysis that preeminent powers, in large measure, have not declined or collapsed because of failure on the military battlefield, but largely many of the most preeminent powers in history have begun their decline, or their decline was caused by debt explosions within their societies and civilizations. And you could trace that all back into ancient times, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to pre-revolutionary France, to the Ottoman Empire, to the British Empire. I believe in many ways in American exceptionalism because of who we are and what we stand for, and certainly in terms of our values and our ideals and what we have succeeded in doing in becoming a preeminent power and a great nation. But we are not exceptional if we don't get our financial and economic house in order. I think this will affect anyone and any country. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening. He certainly understands the importance of the economic, fiscal, and monetary policies ahead of us, and we are delighted that he could join us tonight. I know he will have a great deal of insight into the pressing challenges we face. He is the Senior Managing Director of Macroeconomic Advisers, LLC, a company he co-founded in 1982. Prior to the founding of Macroeconomic Advisers, he held the position of Senior Economist at the World Headquarters of the IBM Corporation. Before that, he served with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He has frequently testified on economic and fiscal matters before committees in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. He also participates in the meetings of outside consultants to both the Congressional Budget Office and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and is a member of the Bureau of Economic Analysis Advisory Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joel Prakken to the podium. Joel.
Well, thank you for that introduction. That guy sounds pretty interesting. I'd like to meet him sometime. I'm really pleased and privileged to be here. It's an important conference on a vital topic. And on the plane down here today, I thought to myself, what can I say to you tonight that will enlighten you and entertain you, rivet you to your seats, while setting the stage for the completion of the program tomorrow, including the keynote address from Senator Simpson. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. First, two disclosures. My firm has a consulting relationship with the Obama administration. Okay, now don't react too negatively to that, okay, because we also had consulting relationships with every administration going all the way back to the first Reagan term. I raise this so that when you hear my remarks later, you can judge me to have some credibility as an impartial analyst and definitely an equal opportunity critic. Now, how did we keep those consulting relationships through all those changes of power back and forth between Democrats and Republicans? And I like to think it's because we have an eclectic, reasonable, reality-based view of how the economy works that left most people in those administrations kind of unhappy with us and some others in those administrations okay with us. But that leads to my second disclosure, and that is the economic paradigm from which I judge the goings-on in Washington these days. So let me start that part of the discussion by informing you that unabashedly, in the short run, I am a Keynesian. And what that means to me is that in the near term, GDP is driven by aggregate demand, by spending. Spending by households, spending by businesses, spending by foreigners on our goods and services, spending by government. In fact, one of the implications of my unabashed Keynesianism is that government spending and tax cuts in the near term boost economic growth and vice versa, particularly if you're away from full employment. Now, of course, you know what one of Keynes' most famous quips was, in the long run, we're all dead. That's where I part company from Lord Keynes. We might all be dead in the long run, but somebody will be alive, I hope. And so we do have to worry about the longer run consequences of these short run sort of Keynesian policies. And so maybe you'll be happy to hear me confess then that in the long run, I'm a supply sider. That is, I think of the level of GDP in the economy as being determined primarily by the supplies of capital and labor that are combined to produce widgets within the borders of the United States. So in that longer run context, let me describe to you briefly then my view of how deficits and debt fit into my paradigm. I think of a deficit, a federal deficit, as a vehicle for taking private saving, people buying treasury bonds, treasury bills, thinking they're saving, and converting it into public spending. The deficit converts private saving into public spending. Now, some public spending legitimately should be thought of as productive investment with a societal return that is in excess of the cost of the borrowing. I mean, really, is there anybody here that thinks the interstate highway system was a bad investment? Probably not. The space program? Well, maybe so, some. But education, ports, border defense, national defense. I mean, some of this public spending is clearly an investment with a rate of return that makes that spending worthwhile. But if the public spending is on current consumption items that crowd out productive private sector investments, that's another story, because there's less private capital in the future, less return to that, and an eventual reduction in living standards that almost certainly would be accompanied by higher rates of interest on everything from mortgages to auto loans to corporate debt. So in my paradigm then, the way that I think about the world, there is this critical policy dilemma, and we heard it referred to in the discussion earlier today. There's a long-run gain from deficit reduction, no doubt, but there is almost certainly short-run pain as well. Okay, and today, that short-run pain would be inflicted on an already painfully weak economy. So this is, I think a real policy dilemma, the short run versus the long run that we're struggling with in an economy that's operating well below its potential capacity now. Now, you know what the problems are. I probably don't have to recite them, but I'm going to briefly just so you can see my take on these things. We have large current deficits, roughly 8% of GDP. We have a mountain of federal debt, roughly 65% or so of GDP. Maybe more importantly, we have a huge unfunded future liability, okay, which is computed as the present discounted value between all the spending that we've promised to make to our citizens in the future, less the amount of taxes that we could collect from the current tax code in the future. And estimates of this difference range anywhere from 80 to 120 trillion, yes, trillion with a T, dollars. It's a huge, huge number. And actually, it could be far worse than that. I mean, the CBO's official calculation of this number makes pretty unrealistic assumptions about the so-called excessive growth of healthcare expenditures. That is, how much healthcare spending grows in excess of GDP. And usually the CBO doesn't allow for the fact that if we actually tried to sustain these policies into the future, that interest rates eventually would rise, investment would get crowded out, GDP growth would slow, revenues would fall, and the whole process would explode. So we really do have a massive problem on our hands here. How did we get here? This is a question that's asked of me all the time when I go out and give speeches, particularly sort of to the Chamber of Commerce sorts of crowds or the investment advisory kind of crowds. How did we get here? And I made a list of things that I think are important. It'd be interesting to see whether you agree with them or not. Okay, first of all, Social Security and Medicare are the biggest part of the unfunded future liability. But this isn't new, right? We've known that these programs have been out of balance for a long time. But I think one of the things that's happened is time has gone by. And so our proximity to the tipping point where these become vitally catastrophic in terms of their effects on the budget is so much closer now, okay, that we can kind of smell the fear that the imbalance in these programs is creating. But there have been many other things along the way that have helped land us in this mess. I think the Reagan tax cuts and the defense buildup, clearly part of the picture. The national debt grew very, very quickly during those 8 years. There were the Bush tax cuts. There was Medicare prescription drug benefits during the Bush years. And it is interesting how people change their tune from one generation to the next. For example, one prominent Republican legislator who is now campaigning pretty aggressively against the expansion of Medicare benefits, when questions about his vote in favor of the prescription drug benefit back then said, quote, well, we were doing some good then. I guess not now. We had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can argue whether they were necessary or not, but it is interesting, almost amusing, is it not, that Larry Lindsey, former presidential advisor, essentially got fired from his job for claiming that those wars would cost $200 billion. $1 trillion and change later, they're still going on, and of course, at $150 billion a year, they're cooked into the CBO baseline projections forever. So they definitely are part of the fixture here. And then there was the Great Recession. We heard some discussion of this earlier. Revenues fell sharply. Some government programs spending increased automatically in those circumstances. We also had the stimulus bill in 2009 and some other stimulus acts along the way. And cyclically, the debt mushroomed during this period. Now, you'll notice that I didn't say anything about the TARP, the Toxic Asset Relief Program, which I view basically as a loan that is a lot of which is going to be paid back, and really I think is a minor player in all of this. And I didn't say anything about the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, if you will. And the reason is that at least in the official scorings by CBO, this costs very little over the first 10 years, and over the next 10 years actually, nets, is a net plus. Now, you could disagree with the scoring and say that CBO just doesn't have a clue about how this program is going to explode out of control, but the fact of the matter is, in the official scoring, this is not a major component to the mess that we're in now. Now, what are the implications of this? You heard a little bit about this earlier, but I think I'd summarize it with this one statement. We simply can't repeat the policies of the past. So one of the things that you hear argued, particularly on the right these days, is, hey, the long-run historical average of taxes as a share of GDP is 18% or 19%, and spending is, only a little bit more than that. So why don't we just go back and do that again? It worked for all those years. Let's do it again. Well, the problem is the historical average age of people is a lot younger than they are now, and the historical average life expectancy is a lot shorter than it is now, and the historical average real healthcare cost was a lot lower than it is now. Okay, and so none of those things could be perpetuated as they were in the past, at least with the current combination of taxes and spending. All right, now. I think I bring a somewhat different perspective to this discussion than some of the more academically inclined presenters that I was listening to today. I mean, I have to make a forecast what's actually going to happen in the economy over the next 2, 3, even 10 or 15 years. So let me start then with the question, what will happen and when if we don't make any actions, if we take no actions? How do I think about this problem? Well, the first point I think I'd make is before anything really bad can happen on the federal debt front, investors have to change their minds. Now, why do I say that? How many of you are familiar with modern finance theory? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. So that if you are, I'll remind you that in modern finance theory, the yield on a 10-year Treasury note or the yield on a 30-year Treasury bond is very importantly determined, primarily determined by investors' expectations of short-term interest rates every day, every month, every quarter for the next 10 or 30 years, the federal funds rate for the next 30 years. Okay, well, have you seen what the yields on 10-year notes are or 30-year bonds? They're extremely low. Okay, so how can that be? Well, there are three possible explanations. Investors might expect the U.S. economy to be in a decades-long economic funk, sort of a lost decade or two, a la Japan, that compels the Fed to keep interest rates at rock-bottom low levels. That's not the consensus forecast for the U.S. economy, so I don't think that's a very good explanation of why long-term interest rates are as low as they are. It could be that investors don't appreciate what the budget mess eventually could mean for interest rates. I think that's hard to believe given what's going on in Europe now. I think the consequences of fiscal profligacy are pretty evident now in Europe. And if investors really thought the United States was approaching that sort of circumstance, interest rates could not be as low as they are now. So that essentially leaves just one explanation, and that is investors actually expect the budget mess to get fixed over these time horizons. Okay, they have priced into bond yields a fix, a fiscal fix. Okay, and as long as they expect that to be true, as long as they expect that to happen, okay, we're not going to see this sort of insidious upward pressure on interest rates that you've seen in other countries that are approaching sort of sovereign debt crisis. So it must be that investors haven't lost faith yet, but of course they could. They could. And, you know, what would be the process through which they lose faith? There are two things that I would point out on that front. One process that is gradual and insidious, but sure, is this process of government borrowing gradually crowding out private sector capital investments. Okay, with less capital, the marginal product of capital goes up, interest rates gradually rise. Okay, and this is a kind of process that you can actually get a handle on with an economic model or an econometric model. There's a wide range of models out there used to get at this particular phenomenon. Okay, our particular model says that if we tried to sustain current fiscal policies for the next 10 or 15 years, that long-term interest rates could rise by 200 or 300 basis points more than they otherwise would if we were pursuing a sustainable policy. That's a lot. What that means is when we get back to full employment, instead of the 10-year note yield being 5.5, it would be 8. That would be a lot more expensive in terms of mortgages, car loans, and so on. But the bigger and more unpredictable danger, I think, is the possibility that investors will simply lose confidence that our government has in place a process for the big fix, for the fix. We got a little taste of that this summer when we flirted with default and we had the ratings downgrade and all that. You could sort of see what the dynamic was there. We're nowhere close to the Grecian situation, as I heard someone arguing earlier today. Okay. But what's frightening about this possibility is we don't know when it could happen, and when it happens, it could happen really fast. It's very different than the gradual crowding out of private capital that gradually pushes interest rates up and lowers our standard of living. This could happen unexpectedly and very quickly if investors decide they've been wrong all this time, there's not going to be a fiscal fix. The process is broken. Okay, now I do want to remind you that our experience this summer with the debt ceiling negotiations was not a good indicator of how this could end up going. What happened over the summer was a ratings downgrade created so much uncertainty that the ensuing flight to safety actually lowered Treasury yields. Treasury yields went down, not up. Okay, that can't happen too many more times. That can't happen too many more times, but it did happen this summer. Instead, I think you should be thinking about Grecian formula light, where eventually, if investors lose confidence that the government process for addressing the debt situation, they lose confidence in it, then you could see rising risk premium on Treasury yields that would not be offset by flight to quality. Now, both of these forces then would lead to upward pressure on interest rates, but it's going to be a little hard to tell over the next 4 or 5 years how much these forces are in play, because there's going to be a sharp cyclical rise in interest rates anyway as monetary policy eventually renormalizes. So the federal funds rate, which is at 0 now, is going to go back up to 4.5, something like that, and the Treasury note yield, which is less than 2, will go back up to between 5 and 6. Okay, and it's going to be hard as that's happening to know whether it's happening because the budget situation is getting worse or investors are losing faith, or whether it's just a cyclical tightening of interest rates as the economy recovers. And that's one of the uncertainties. We might not know for sure, okay, how far we are down the slippery slope. So my conclusion from all of this is we really need to apply considered fiscal discipline before financial markets impose their own harsher version of that discipline. And in all of that, what's the policy goal? And by that, I mean not what I think the policy goal should be. What do I think we are grappling towards here as a society in all this sort of Sturm und Drang over fiscal policy? Okay, is it to eliminate or to stabilize the deficit or the debt? I mean, there's so many possibilities. You could eliminate the debt. You could stabilize the deficit. Is it to renegotiate, or is it to preserve the intergenerational compact? Oh, wait, come to think of it, I've already told you that that's impossible. That is, preserving the intergenerational compact is impossible. So let me restate the last question. Are we trying to preserve the tax or the entitlement side of the current intergenerational compact? And over what horizon are we trying to do these things? How quickly and how slowly? Okay, I don't think our policymakers have a clear view here of what really they're trying to accomplish when. I really don't. But I do sense that in some totally chaotic manner, we're groping towards a policy that will stabilize the debt to GDP ratio within a decade to buy time to address the longer run issue of entitlement reform. Now, my estimate is that would take somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion of deficit reduction through 2022, maybe. About what was called for by the co-chairs of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Unfortunately, that's actually not enough to come close to handling that $80 to $140 trillion unfunded future liability. That's just a down payment to sort of stabilize things briefly while we get our act together and decide what we're going to do about those unfunded promises, beyond 2022. Now, incidentally, this is an aside. I'm not a political scientist. I play one on TV sometimes, but I always chuckle when I see each of the sides accusing the other of playing politics with Medicare or taxes, whatever. I really don't see it that way. I think there were competing visions of society that could be accomplished only through very different policy prescriptions, and there are legitimate differences on where the country should go. I don't think it's playing politics. Well, it is playing politics. Okay, it is. But there's different views of where the country should go. Okay, but at least from my perspective, I do think that there are some bad actors out there in terms of playing fast and loose with facts and with economics. Okay, it's not to say that economics is settled, particularly macroeconomics is settled. It's not. There are lots of different models, there are different paradigms, there are lots of ways to think about things. But there was some atrocious analysis being done out there in support of the various proposals. Since you can find this on my blog, I'm going to mention one in particular. At the time that the Ryan Plan came out, the Heritage Foundation put out an analysis of the macroeconomic impacts of that plan using a large-scale econometric model built by a competitor of ours, for whom I have a good deal of respect. And this analysis showed that immediately, despite dramatic cuts in spending, immediately the unemployment rate would fall quickly, okay, and GDP would be higher. Now, since I knew a lot about this model, okay, I knew that wasn't what that model would say if you put through Ryan-type spending cuts. I knew that's not what it would say, so I got myself a copy of this program, of this study, and I called up the people at my competitor. I said, aren't you a little embarrassed that you let these guys use your model to get these results? Because I know your model doesn't produce those kind of results. They said, yeah, but it's kind of hard now. They subscribe to the model, so we can't really sort of say anything about it. I said, well, I can say something about it. Okay, so I went through this analysis, and I found all the ways where they just manipulated the model to produce the result. And it was ridiculous. Okay, and furthermore, the anomalous details in their results that they didn't bother to notice were stunning. For example, okay, they claimed that this plan would result in an additional construction of 5 million houses. Okay, but only 300,000 more households. So 4.7 million empty houses were going to be built. Okay, how did that come about? Well, they just adjusted up housing starts in the simulation without any good reason because they wanted to show stronger GDP growth. I take some pride in the fact that our analysis of that basically removed that study from serious public discussion. No one talks about it anymore. Ryan doesn't talk about it anymore, and he shouldn't be talking about it. He shouldn't be talking about it. It was a bad piece of analysis. But I'm an equal opportunity critic. Now, Rudy Penner said there wasn't a plan out there that balanced the budget before 2030. He's wrong about that. The Progressive Caucus put out a plan that had massive tax increases in it, and really massive tax increases because not only were they going to balance the budget by 2018 or 2017, they were also going to have lots of public investments as well. Okay, and they made a claim that the supply side effects of all these public investments would boost economic growth by a very substantial amount. And when we did the math on this, we just couldn't come up with enough public capital with a high enough rate of return to even remotely approach the growth rates of GDP that they were claiming for the program. So I'm saying this to warn you that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty out there amongst macroeconomists about the short and long run effects of any of these policies that we're talking about. And there is, because of that uncertainty, very considerable temptation to slant results, to, as we like to say, assume the answer. So be cautious of what you read. Listen to sensible people like me. Okay, I told you I'm trying to be entertaining as well as informative. All right, now what the heck is going to happen? We have to actually decide what's going to happen and put it into our forecast. I think the framework for considering what's going to happen is the recently enacted Budget Control Act of 2011. So let me offer some observations on this piece of legislation and how we're thinking about its implications for the fiscal outlook. Okay, first of all, we won't have to revisit the debt ceiling issue again until after the next election. I'm very happy about that. I'd like to avoid that debacle again, or at least delay visiting that debacle again for as long as possible. My own view was that it roiled financial markets considerably. It cast some doubt on the ability of our government to solve this problem in a gentlemanly and womanly way, in a timely basis, and we lost some standing around the world as a consequence of that. We shouldn't feel, now it's true that the rest of the world, in particular Europe, is doing maybe even a worse job with their debt crisis than we are. But as you wisecracked at our meeting a couple weeks ago, we shouldn't feel good if we're the best-looking horse left in the glue factory. Okay, I gave you credit for that one. So. All right, this bill also calls for a vote on a hard budget balance amendment, and we heard some discussion about this earlier. I think this is a silly idea. It's so silly that I'm going to take a few minutes to digress on it and talk about what a silly idea I think it is. There's a popular appeal to it. The government has to do what we all do sitting around our table every night, meet our ends meet. Okay, nobody ever tells you that households borrow a lot of money. They borrow money for cars. They borrow money for mortgages. But it sounds appealing and seems like a good idea until you think about what it really means at a practical level. So I'm going to repeat some of the math that I heard earlier today, maybe from a slightly different level. Right before the Great Recession, the federal deficit was actually a little bit less than $200 billion. I mean, we consider that a balanced budget these days, right? Okay, so let's say that before the Great Recession, we actually had a balanced budget. Okay, but a couple years into the Great Recession, the deficit had ballooned to $1.5 trillion. Well, figure it out. Under a balanced budget amendment, we'd have to start by cutting spending or raising taxes by $1.5 trillion. Now, just mechanically, that's a 7 percentage point reduction in GDP growth, which means at the height of the Great Recession, when GDP was declining at a 6% annual rate, if you piled the BBA on top of it, you'd be declining at a 13% annualized rate, and that's before allowing for any multiplier effects. We'd probably be declining at a 20% annual rate. We put this through our model, and we got unemployment rates 18, 20% in a simulation like that. Okay, now practically, what would it take to shrink the deficit by that much just in static terms? Well, you could raise taxes by that much, but it actually would mean zeroing out, okay, not just paring the growth or reducing a little bit, zeroing out all of discretionary spending, all of defense, all judiciary, all Congress, all CDC, all of it. Now, can anybody possibly think that that's a smart thing to do in an economic downturn? No, it's a silly thing to do. Now, softer versions of a balanced budget amendment might achieve a balanced budget over the business cycle with safety valves and releases, things like that. But I think you get the point. It's very difficult to legislate fiscal morality this way with a rule. It's far better for the administration and Congress to do their jobs and legislate sustainable, sensible policy rather than yoke ourselves to a mechanical, fiscal rule. Now, back to that was my digression. Back to the Budget Control Act of 2011. The first part of the BCA are these spending caps on discretionary spending that are going to trim about $900 billion from federal debt over the next through 2021. Sort of a down payment on what's to come, and then the legislation formed this joint select committee, the super committee, to recommend a minimum of another $1.2 trillion of savings over that same period, and a goal of at least $1.5 trillion. And these recommendations have to be made by November 23rd for an enactment and an up and down vote by December 23rd, or we will trigger some very front-loaded spending sequestrations beginning in 2013. Incidentally, 2013 is a year of huge fiscal risk. I mean, in principle, it's possible that all the Bush tax cuts will expire in 2013. Okay, we've already got these $900 billion of spending cap reductions from the Budget Control Act, and that the super committee could fail to see its recommendations enacted, and we'll get these front-loaded spending sequestrations in 2013. The fiscal drag would be awesomely huge at a time when the economy is very likely to still be struggling. I'm very worried about the outcome of the fiscal debate, particularly for 2013. So some observations and thoughts on the Budget Control Act then. Now, many groups are urging this Joint Select Committee to go big. That's because the minimum target of savings that the committee is charged with coming up with is only half of what's required to stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio during this decade. Remember, I told you it took $4 to $5 million? Well, the Budget Control Act has $900 billion in discretionary spending caps, and maybe another $1.5 trillion, let's say, in the committee recommendations. That's not enough. It's not enough. At least when judged against a, quote, current policy baseline, and I'm going to return to the issue of the baseline in a minute. So this is just the beginning of the process. It's not enough to stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio by 2021. Point number 2, time is amazingly short. I heard Doug Elmendorf, who's the director of the CBO, speak at our client meeting a couple weeks ago, say that CBO needs 2 to 3 weeks to score this legislation, okay, which means 2 to 3 weeks before the recommendations can be made to Congress, CBO has to be presented with the recommendations so they can score it, so they can in fact ratify that it meets the law, the savings required by the law. That means there's only 3 weeks to go. Right? We're in the first week of October. There's very little time before the committee has to be closing in on a set of recommendations. And so really the committee only has by early November to get their work done. Now, that it should be clear to everyone in the room that that's not nearly enough time to put together comprehensive tax and entitlement overhauls for an up or down vote, for Pete's sake. I mean, these are issues we've been struggling with for decades. There's no way a committee is going to settle in a month and go to the halls of Congress on an up or down vote, the whole thing, take it or leave it. It's just not going to happen. And so what I expect really is that this committee is going to look for the relatively easy things that can be done to reach the minimum stated goals, perhaps with the objective of avoiding that sequester in 2013. But I'm not even so sure that everyone in that committee wants to avoid the sequester. I think you can make a case that the Tea Party types, the people with Tea Party leanings, hope it does get locked up, hope the recommendations aren't made or aren't enacted, so we get the big sequester of discretionary spending in 2013. They think that would be good for the economy. I think it's a big risk to the economic outlook. Now, one of the things that I heard a few weeks ago at our own session in Washington that I didn't fully understand, but I think is a very interesting possibility to consider, is that apparently under the law, this committee can extend its own life. As Rudy was saying to me over it can actually declare war if it wants to. That's a joke. It can't really do that. It can't really do that. Okay, that went too far maybe. But it can extend its own life. Okay, so there is this possibility then, I suppose, that they could come up with the easy savings to meet the minimum requirements of the law, and then re-up themselves for, I don't know, however long it takes for the committee to come up with a set of proposals on major tax reform and major entitlement reform. That might actually be an optimistic sort of outlook, because It would give investors some sense that that short-run progress is being made and long-run issues were being considered. Something I think would be the hallmark of a sensible fiscal policy. Now, I do want to return to this issue of the savings that the committee is supposed to propose relative to what? A current policy baseline or a current law baseline? Now, if you don't understand the ins and outs of these baselines, I can try to give you a flavor for why these differences are important. If the savings are judged using a current law baseline, that is, assuming that current law is in place, including the expiration of all the tax cuts in 2013, then the savings that are recommended by the Joint Committee would come on top of the savings from the expiring Bush tax cuts. That would really be going big. That would be huge. Of course, if, as is much more likely, the committee recommends extending the Bush tax cuts, it would then have to come up with trillions more in additional saving to offset the lost revenue from the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. This was the approach of the so-called Ryan plan, which didn't make all that much progress on a deficit in the first 10 years, despite horrendously severe cuts in spending, because it also assumed that the Bush tax cuts didn't expire and had to pay for it with really big spending cuts. Using a current policy baseline, that is, assuming that current tax codes are propagated forever as your starting point, the committee could hit its targets very easily just by allowing the Bush tax cuts to sunset. There's enough money in there. It's for $400 billion a year. Over 10 years, that's not chump change. They could meet their targets just by following the current law. And it's easier, I think, to discuss the possibility of tax reforms, including the possibility of tax increases in this context. I feel that it is. And this was the approach that the Simpson-Bowles Commission took. Their recommendations were judged relative to current policy baseline. I think that is the most sensible way to sort of think about it, and I hope that is what is done. But who knows? Currently, I guess CBO would do it according to current law, but this committee can basically direct CBO to do whatever it wants CBO to do, I believe. Now, another thing we're starting to hear about in the press is that the recommendations of the committee might be dynamically scored. What does that mean? Well, in a dynamic scoring, one attempts to figure out how the changes in policy that are being proposed will affect the macroeconomy with feedback effects on revenues. So you don't just assume, you don't blindly assume that there's no response to the economy to the policy. You allow for the possibility that there is a response, and then you could raise some extra revenues if your policies strengthen the economy. And I think Republicans really like this idea, especially when it comes to tax reform. The idea goes something like this. Start with revenue-neutral tax reform. That is, you broaden the tax base. Maybe you get rid of interest deduction for mortgages. Maybe you get rid of deductions for health care. And, of course, that would tend to raise revenues, but then you lower marginal tax rates by just enough so that before anything else changes, there's no change in the total amount of revenues that the government's collecting. But then you argue that because tax rates are lower, marginal tax rates are lower, you're going to stimulate growth from the supply side of the economy over the long haul, and that's going to raise revenues, that will help you, advance towards the goal of debt reduction, maybe even meet the targets of the super committee. And also, it kind of gets around that pesky no tax pledge that a lot of Republicans have made. It's that's one way to circumvent that little inconvenience. Now, I'd say in principle, this is a wonderful idea, but I see Jane here, and I know that John Diamond of the Baker Institute and I all worked together 10 years ago within the Joint Tax Committee to see if it was possible to take an envelope of models, all kinds of models, Keynesian models, supply-side models, real business cycle models, overlapping generation models, computable GE models. These days you have to throw in DSGE models. Take all these models and figure out if there was enough of a consensus between modelers that we could actually agree on how much revenues would respond dynamically to I guess it was a tax reform policy that we looked at back then. Okay, the principal point here is it takes a model to do this. Okay, whose model is it going to be? Well, I've already told you that I'm highly suspicious of model-based economic analysis that's produced by any agendized group in Washington, and you just can't tell me there wouldn't be temptation to pick a model that gives you the results that you want. The temptation would just be it would be like prohibition. It would be very, very tempting to do. And of course, once the can of worms is open, you can't just dynamically score tax reform. You have to score all elements of whatever policy is proposed. So, for example, I believe, and many models show, that spending cuts slow near-term economic growth and, at least for a while, lose some revenues. So if you're going to dynamically score the spending cuts, hey, you got to have bigger spending cuts to make up for the lost revenue. Okay, and then, equally important, and I think very controversial, in many of these models that allow for variations in resource utilization rates, you have to make an assumption about how the Federal Reserve will adjust monetary policy in response to the fiscal policy in question. So now it's not just dynamic scoring of fiscal policy, it's forecasting how the Fed's going to respond to your dynamic scoring of fiscal policy. So these are things that we love to do within our halls and in the halls of academia. We can do these things. But my recommendation is don't do it. Even though it would be a consulting boon for me, I think it's a lousy idea. I'd say stick with the static scoring of policy options and then just be absolutely delighted if later on revenues surprise you to the upside. I mean, you could even cut taxes when that happens. But I would say just don't wade into this sort of quagmire of choosing a model, arguing about the parameters in the model, guessing what the Fed's going to do. It's a no-win proposition, I think, for policymakers. All right, so I've been talking a lot about fiscal policy. I want to end by saying something about monetary policy, and then we'll go until the manager here gives me the hook. And there's no relief pitcher tonight, so 10 minutes. Okay, all right, that's good. We're in good shape. Oh, okay, 10 minutes until questions?
You have about 10 minutes.
Okay. Monetary policy. Let's say the committee, the joint committee, the Joint Select Committee, does go big. And endorses something along the lines of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, both in magnitude and maybe even composition between taxes and spending. Now, we've estimated, using our economic model, that holding interest rates constant. Okay, now this is important. This is holding interest rates constant. We're going to divide this exercise into two parts, the pure Keynesian part and then the longer-run supply-side response. Holding interest rates constant, that much fiscal drag would raise the unemployment rate by 2 percentage points over the next 10 years. Instead of being at 5 in 2021, the unemployment rate will be at 7, something like that. Now, to offset that drag, long-term interest rates would have to decline, and we estimate fairly quickly by about 150 basis points relative to a baseline path that shows interest rates rising. Now, remember at the top of my presentation, I argued that there can't be much of an announcement effect on long-term interest rates from just announcing that you've achieved a deal, because as I argued earlier, investors already assume there will be a deal. I mean, we might go off a little bit with respect to the timing or not, but my argument here, it's an important one, is you shouldn't argue that interest rates will fall dramatically just because a deal is announced. First of all, it might not be viewed as credible or implementable, but even if it is, something like that already is priced in to long-term interest rates. So the only way that interest rates can come down to offset this fiscal drag is for the Fed to ease monetary policy even further. Well, that's a bit of a problem, no? Because the Fed is out of conventional ammo. It can't lower the federal funds rate anymore. It's already at 0, so it would have to take additional unconventional measures. And essentially the two choices here are promise, even more explicitly than already has been promised, to keep the federal funds rate lower for even longer than's already been promised. Okay, or expand or twist the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve even further to try to manipulate a decline in long-term interest rates, which the Fed believes is the key sort of interest rate for stimulating aggregate demand. In my own mind, I have some question about whether in today's circumstances the Fed actually could offset such a huge fiscal drag. It's not it's in a box. It's used up a lot of the arrows in its quiver. But even if it could, we have this some would say interesting, I would say outrageous letter from the 4 top Republican leaders, an open letter to Ben Bernanke, pleading with him not to use unconventional policy to stimulate economic growth. Well, what's going to happen then? You get the fiscal drag in 2013. The economy's still in the hopper. The unemployment rate starts going up to 10%. Maybe these guys have won the White House, and what are they going to say to the Fed? Don't do anything? Gee, kind of scary. So this argues, I think, pretty convincingly that there are two reasons to delay sharp fiscal drag. The first is that the economy is really weak and susceptible to tipping back into recession. But the second is if you wait a couple years when interest rates have come off the zero bound, when the federal funds rate has come off the zero bound, at least the Fed is in a better position to then accommodate the fiscal drag by re-lowering interest rates, if you will. All right, so I'm done. So this is the part of the presentation where I entertain questions. Notice I didn't say I answer your questions, I entertain them. There is a difference. But why don't I open the floor to this, that, or the other thing? Let's go over here. Oh, you're very kind. Yes, sir.
I have 3 questions, but
3?
Oh, no.
I'll try to ask them quickly. You can answer as many as you want, or even none. Number one, you suggested the downside effect of the 1.5 trillion reduction in the deficit to get back to balanced budget as they existed pre-recession. And you said the unemployment rate would be 18% instead of 9%.
Oh, the simulation experiment in which we assumed a balanced budget amendment in the middle of the
My question to you is your parameters built into your model symmetric on the other side, or not?
Basically, yes. That's
So
one.
that's easy.
Okay, that one's easy.
Do you factor in any effect of, they say there's a lot of uncertainty pervading the economy, which is why investors are unwilling to invest. Do you build in any effects? How do you parameterize it?
Right.
And the third question is about Europe. What's the effect of what's going on in Europe?
Okay, so the second question was, I guess when we were running that experiment, did we factor in uncertainty and risk? The answer is we didn't, but if we did, there'd be a lot more uncertainty and risk. It would be even worse than just running the simulation. We'd have to worry about the stock, equity risk premiums shooting up, default rates in the private sector shooting up. It would be much worse than just the simple simulation experiment that we ran. It would be a catastrophe. And the third, how do we think about Europe? Probably not in the context of that balanced budget simulation. I view Europe as the single biggest risk. Housing is the single biggest drag on the economy. Europe is the single biggest downside risk factor. And we account for it in our forecast by assuming that the VIX and private credit spreads will remain at very elevated levels for a very long time. And that slows economic growth in our model. Jane? I knew you'd have to have some kind of question.
About dynamic scoring.
Oh, you know all about it. You don't have to ask me a question about dynamic scoring.
Or maybe more of an observation,
Okay.
what you think about it. First of all, it's always, and I used to tell people at CBO who did like 7 different models, many of them dynamic, the kind of models that John likes to build. And the first question I would ask is, why should we use in dynamic scoring a model that we are not willing to use for forecasting, either as a private forecaster like you, or by the Fed, or by CBO? I mean, put your money where your mouth is. It just seems to me absurd to to adopt these dynamic, pardon me, John, you're very good at your job, and the other thing is, when the Joint Tax Committee did this as an advisory thing, they did several models, and of course if you're actually going to do it for scoring, you've got to choose one, but they also found that we don't count in our scoring of the crowding out of private investment from a debt-financed tax change.
Well, some
and so that, that would be actually, in realistic terms, a more powerful sort of effect.
Well, you're just making my point for me. I mean,
But that would be included in dynamic scoring.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you could argue
And in
that
fact,
you
the
should.
one, but I mean, I've always argued for dynamic analysis, which is different than dynamic scoring.
But if you
it's
could,
adding on information to a static score.
Right, and that's fine, but that's not what they're talking about.
You actually have a good point there. So let me tell you how we try to do this. It really comes back to what's the baseline. If the baseline is an unsustainable policy, you shouldn't then show the economy going back to full employment with steady interest rates. You have to show the economy deteriorating, interest rates shooting up with a lot of crowding out. So the dynamic score of the sustainable fiscal policy fixes all of that, and the benefits are huge. Okay. But the estimated benefits in the short run and the long run will depend vitally on which model you choose. And it is the fact that, well, every administration that we work with, back to Reagan, for purposes of doing their forecasting, and this kind of uses models that have short-run Keynesian properties and longer-run supply sides. Solo growth in the long run, so it makes the dynamic score, it makes the cyclical part of the dynamic score very, very important. Okay, over here.
How have you taken into effect the inflation, particularly with the tremendous increase in the money supply?
Oh, don't talk to me about that. Okay, inflation will be whatever the Fed wants it to be. Okay, and it's true that the monetary base has exploded, but have you seen what's happened to the money multiplier? It's just gone down like that. There's not been a big increase in the money supply. Okay, there's a lot of slack in the economy. The dollar is rising, which pushes down inflation. Inflation expectations, whether they're measured by the survey of professional forecasters or the five-year forward inflation rate backed out of the tip markets, are well under control. Okay, I see essentially no risk at all that what the Fed has done up to this point and might contemplate doing in addition to this is much of a threat to sort of long-run inflation or inflation expectations. I think that is just a totally over-trumped argument. Over here. I was a little direct there. I'm sorry if I was, but
in order to deal with the short calendar that you described, isn't the course that the committee more or less has to follow to lay down targets that committees of Congress have to meet and enact those into law with some kind of really nasty fallback consequences if they fail to do so?
Rudy, you want to help me with that? I agree. Yes. I'm not an expert on the details of how this will be implemented, but there's not much time to implement whatever is going to be implemented.
Especially with tax reforms.
Oh, especially. Well, and entitlement reform too. Okay, we'll go over here.
Your point about investors and interest.
Yeah.
So much of our debt is now being held by the Chinese. So, do you have any feel for how much longer? I mean, do you worry about them changing their views of investing in the U.S.?
Yes, I do. So let me give you a sense of that. Estimates suggest that quantitative easing, the first round of quantitative easing, may have reduced interest rate, and what was that, $600 billion of debt that the Fed purchased. Let's say that they reduced interest rates by 50 basis points. I mean, that's probably an outside estimate, 35 basis points. Now we have this Operation Twist, and Bernanke was saying in testimony the other day, that's kind of like we've lowered interest rates again by maybe the same amount. So, well, how much debt do the Chinese absorb every year? Large amounts. So if they stopped absorbing that, you could sort of figure out implicitly what the implications are for interest rates going forward. They would just gradually escalate. Okay, and that increase, I think, would be accentuated by the chaos that would ensue were they to make an announcement that they've had enough of the dollars. And okay, now fortunately, I don't think it's very likely that that's going to happen. What are they going to do? Buy euros? I don't think so. I don't think so. Okay, back here.
What is your take on these people who say that the economy's fallen into this liquidity trap, that in fact we're on the verge of a Japan-type situation, that actually the only way out of it is a huge burst of inflation or a huge, and unfortunately we're faced with a political party who seems like the Republicans, that their constituents want the policies that will continue a Japan-type situation in the U.S.
Right. I think we are in something of a liquidity trap. I think we are in serious danger. Look, we've already had a lost half decade, right? Okay, we're in serious danger of certainly of a period of subpar growth for several years, where I would say we don't have a 50% risk yet of going back into another technical recession. I'm very, very worried about that. Okay, and I agree with you that the long-run problem really is the imbalance in the entitlement programs. What's the short-run policy solution to the long-run problem? Whack the crap out of discretionary spending in the middle of a very weak economy. That just doesn't make much sense to me. Okay, what you really want to do is to come up with a credible plan to address the large unfunded balance while administering the least possible pain to the economy in its current circumstances, okay, until it's a little bit stronger and interest rates are up to zero bound so that we can absorb the fiscal drag and the Fed can accommodate it. I mean, that's what we need to do. Okay, but I will give you the other side of it, okay, and maybe we'll close on this. It's an intellectual exercise for us, right? We have models that predict this is a great thing to do. It's optimal policy of some sort. But you could argue, and there's sensible people in Washington who are probably saying the same thing. I mean, President Obama is now saying sort of the same thing. But is there a counter-argument that, well, the academics and intellectuals and the model builders, we had all this time to figure this out and get it right, and we didn't do it. We never will. You got to have somebody who comes in and just has a completely radical approach. Say we're going to, whatever the short-run consequences, we're going to suffer now. It's character building. We're going to suffer now. And there's a tiny little bit of me that is partially sympathetic to that notion, because it's just a tiny little bit. Because no matter what was announced, let's say that the committee tomorrow said, hey, we are going to extend the payroll tax holiday. We're even going to expand upon it. And we're going to give the president the infrastructure spending he wants, and that's going to be a nice short-run boost to the economy. It's not a panacea. It's not going to drive the unemployment rate back down to 5, but it's going to help. Okay. In addition, we have come up with a grand scheme to somehow curb particularly medical costs, healthcare costs. Well, the stimulus goes into effect, okay, but the entitlement reform could always be changed later on or not enacted, right? So that's the problem. Is the policy for the long-run fix, is it credible? Is it enactable? Is it sustainable? And that's the dilemma. Short-run pain for long-run gain. When the short-run part you can recognize and do very quickly. The long run could always be changed and come back and not work out the way you said you were going to do it. And that really is the dilemma. And I think that's kind of what's driving this anger now amongst the Tea Party types is they're sick of that. They're saying, look, you keep saying you're going to do it, you keep saying you're going to do it, but you never do. All right, we have a different formula for doing it. And, there's a tiny, tiny little part of me, not the intellectual part, this sort of this kind of nebulous gut feeling that no matter how awful that might be now, in 50 years, we might be better off. So then it becomes a present discounted value exercise, right? How much output do you lose in the short run, or consumption, I guess, not necessarily GDP. Right, and at what interest rate are you going to calculate that? Now, with interest rates as low as they are today, okay, the present value calculation moves very much in favor of the long run, of the long run fix. So, all right, I think Coach Diamond says that I've finished, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Joel, thank you. That was very insightful. We have a full program tomorrow, and I hope we'll see your faces here bright and early. I think Alan Simpson, our keynote, will deliver another fascinating talk. So have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow.